Chapter 1. The Teacup No One Finished. The teacup had been placed not quite where it belonged. It sat a fraction too close to the edge of the small round table by the window, close enough that a careless sleeve might disturb it, though no one present struck Miss Marple as careless. The china itself was of that faintly translucent sort one finds in establishments that wish to suggest refinement without quite committing to it, and the thin brown line of tea left untouched inside had formed a delicate crescent along the rim. Miss Jane Marple noticed it as she settled into her chair, with the careful, unhurried precision that had, over many years, allowed her to observe far more than most people supposed. "Oh, do sit wherever you like, Miss Marple," said Clara Finch, smiling with the effortless warmth of a woman accustomed to making strangers feel expected. The morning room can be rather indecisive about its loyalties in the early hours, drafts thereafter. We do what we can. She moved lightly between tables, adjusting a vase here, aligning a chair there, her manner suggesting attention without fuss. There was something about her, something reassuringly competent that had already been remarked upon by nearly every guest within 24 hours of arrival. Miss Marple folded her gloves, placing them neatly beside her saucer. One always finds, my dear, that rooms reveal their true character only after one has sat quietly in them for a time. I once knew a parlour in St. Mary Mead appeared perfectly agreeable until precisely 11 o'clock each morning, at which point it developed the most determined chill in one corner, always the same corner, you understand. Mrs. Hargreaves insisted it was a matter of the window seal, though we later discovered it had rather more to do with her nephew's habit of slipping out unseen. Clara laughed softly, though not distractedly. Rooms do have their loyalties, I think, though I should hope ours remain more straightforward. At the neighbouring table, Eleanor Price lifted her brush from the small travel sketchbook she had balanced against her teacup. She had been attempting to capture the uneven fall of light across the courtyard stones outside, though she found herself glancing more often than she wished toward the guests within the room. It was, she told herself, simply a habit. One observed people as one observed light where it lingered, where it faltered. "You'll find the mornings here quite peaceful," Clara continued, pouring tea for a newly arrived couple, whose luggage still bore the dust of travel. "Mr. Bellamy is usually the first to arrive, though he prefers to take his tea alone before breakfast proper. A creature of habit, you might say." Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly, almost idly, on the untouched cup by the window. "Indeed," she said, her voice carrying that mild, reflective quality that often encouraged others to speak further. "Habit is such a curious thing. One relies upon it so completely, and yet it can be interrupted." Eleanor noticed Clara's hand pause, just for the smallest moment as she set down the teapot. "Well," Clara said after a fraction of a second too long, "I suppose everything can be, given the right circumstances." The door opened then, admitting a narrow gust of cooler air from the corridor, along with a man whose presence seemed to occupy rather more space than his frame warranted. "Good morning." "Good morning. Terribly sorry. Overslept quite disgracefully," he announced, brushing an imaginary speck from his sleeve. "One loses track of time in these charming old places. No clocks where one expects them, you see." "Mr. Harding," Clara replied smoothly, "you're exactly on time for breakfast, I assure you. Would you care for tea?" "Oh, I never say no to tea, though I rarely finish it," he said, with a quick, almost conspiratorial smile toward Eleanor. "One mustn't form attachments to such fleeting things." Miss Marple glanced at him, then very briefly at the untouched cup by the window again. "Quite so," she murmured. Eleanor shifted in her seat, her attention now divided entirely between her sketch and the subtle, almost imperceptible currents moving through the room. It was not anything one could point to, not a raised voice, not a visible disagreement, but rather the way certain remarks seemed to settle more heavily than others. She turned a page in her sketchbook, though she had not finished the previous one. "Miss Finch," called a voice from the doorway, a kitchen maid, flushed from exertion. "Cook says the deliveries have come early again, and there's the matter of the cellar." Clara's expression did not change, though Eleanor thought she detected the faintest tightening at the corners of her mouth. "I'll come at once," she said. Then, turning back with practised ease, "Do excuse me. Breakfast will be served shortly." As she left, the room seemed to rearrange itself slightly in her absence, like a pattern disturbed, though not yet understood. Miss Marple reached for her own cup, though she did not drink from it immediately. "One does notice," she said gently, as though continuing a conversation no one had realized was still in progress, that in places where many people come and go, it is often the smallest irregularities that matter most. A chair moved an inch too far, a door left not quite as it should be, or indeed, her eyes drifted just for a moment toward the window table, a cup of tea that has been poured but not taken. Mr. Harding gave a short laugh. My dear lady, if one were to concern oneself with every unfinished cup of tea in England, one would never get a moment's rest. Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed, smiling faintly. Though I have found that the difficulty lies not in the number of such cups, but in knowing which one ought not to have been left at all. Eleanor felt quite unexpectedly the urge to close her sketchbook. Instead, she looked again toward the window. The tea had cooled now, one could see it in the way the surface had lost its faint shimmer. No steam rose from it, no hand reached to claim it, and yet, for a place that prided itself on routine, on the quiet reliability of morning rituals, it seemed a curious thing indeed that Arthur Bellamy, who was known never to deviate from his habits, had not returned to finish his tea. Miss Marple stirred her own cup at last, though she added no sugar. In St. Mary Mead, she said, almost to herself, there was a gentleman, Colonel Brent, who prided himself on punctuality, never missed his morning walk, not once in 30 years. And then, one Tuesday, he failed to appear. Everyone assumed he had simply taken ill, which would have been the sensible conclusion. It was only later that we understood it was not illness at all, but rather that someone had taken advantage of the certainty with which his movements were known. She lifted her eyes, meeting Eleanor's gaze with a look that was both kind and curiously precise. It is a mistake, you see, to think that predictability makes one safe. More often it simply makes one expect. Eleanor swallowed, though she could not have said why. Across the room the untouched teacup remained where it was balanced too near the edge, as though waiting for a hand that had, for reasons not yet understood, failed to return. And outside, in the courtyard, a loose cobblestone shifted slightly under no visible weight at all. Chapter 2. What the Courtyard Remembered. By the time breakfast was actually announced, the inn had acquired that strained appearance peculiar to places attempting not to alarm their guests. It was not a disorder exactly. Clara Finch saw to it that there was no visible disorder. Toast appeared in silver racks, eggs in covered dishes, marmalade in small glass pots with the spoons turned neatly outward. Even the flowers on the sideboard, late dahlias, already beginning to thicken at the edges, had been rearranged. Yet the atmosphere had altered. It had become careful. Eleanor Price, who had spent enough time in borrowed houses and hired lodgings to recognise the difference between ordinary hospitality and performed reassurance, sat down at the long breakfast table with the uneasy feeling that everyone present had been told half a fact and was trying to behave as though it were whole. Mr. Harding, already attacking kidneys with more enthusiasm than delicacy, lowered his voice only enough to suggest he would have preferred not to lower it at all. I dare say Bellamy has taken himself off for one of those constitutional turns that retired men are so fond of calling necessary, he said, though it strikes me as odd to leave his tea behind. He was one of those careful fellows, solicitor type, folded his napkin as though it might later be produced in evidence. At the far end of the table, Mrs. Vane, a widow with a voice like brushed silk and eyes that missed very little, while pretending to miss everything, buttered her toast in small, exact motions. My late husband used to vanish from breakfast whenever he anticipated an unpleasant letter, she said. Men dislike being observed during moments of discomfort. They prefer to disappear first and explain afterwards. That may be true of husbands, said Mr. Harding, helping himself again, but Bellamy never struck me as the disappearing sort. He struck me as the sort to remain exactly where he was and make everyone else uncomfortable instead. Miss Marple, who had accepted a boiled egg and nothing further, tapped the shell lightly with her spoon. One notices, does one not, she said in that mild, meandering tone which suggested harmless reflection, and often produced something rather more useful, that there are people who cultivate steadiness because they mistake it for virtue. They like to be thought reliable. It gives them a sort of moral weight, but reliability may also be a form of vanity. Eleanor looked at her. Miss Marple was examining her egg with perfect attention, as though the observation had no particular object. Mrs. Vane glanced up. You speak as though you knew him already. Oh, not at all, said Miss Marple. Only the type. In St. Mary Mead there was a bank manager named Mr. Cuthbertson, who was so regular in his habits that even the sparrows on the church roof adjusted themselves to him. He believed himself a pillar, But pillars, you know, can cast very long shadows over a household. Eleanor saw Mr. Harding grin at that, though whether he understood it she could not tell. Before anyone could pursue the subject, the door from the passage opened, and Inspector Hughes entered with the local doctor just behind him. The inspector was a broad, unshowy man with a weathered face and the sort of quiet tread that suggested he had spent years learning how to come into rooms without disturbing what was already in them. Dr. Lennox, by contrast, looked mildly vexed by the human body in all its forms. Conversation altered at once. It did not stop. Stopping would have been too frank. It thinned, however, and became occupied with butter, coffee, weathercocks, road conditions, and anything else that did not resemble inquiry. Clara Finch crossed from the sideboard to meet them. She had changed her apron. Eleanor noticed that and immediately felt ashamed of noticing. The fresh one was ironed sharply, tied with exact care. Only her hands betrayed her. She kept them loosely folded, but the thumb of the left hand was pressing hard against the knuckle of the right. Inspector Hughes spoke quietly. Clara listened, nodded once, and then said, "I understand. Of course, the guests must be told something, but I should prefer not to cause distress before you are certain." The doctor made a small sound in his throat. "Certain enough that the gentleman is dead, Miss Finch. The rest can wait an hour." A spoon slipped from Mrs. Vane's fingers and rang once against her saucer. Eleanor felt the room contract. Clara turned. "I'm afraid I must ask you all to remain on the premises for the present. Mr. Bellamy has been found in the old cellar passage beyond the kitchen stairs. There appears to have been a fall." She said it well. Too well, perhaps. There was no tremor, no theatrical dismay, only the grave composure of a woman meeting necessity with competence. It inspired confidence immediately. Eleanor saw it in the faces around the table. Even shock submitted to it. Mr. Harding half rose. "Good Lord. Dead?" Dr. Lennox answered before Clara could. "He is dead, yes. Whether from the fall alone remains to be seen." Those last 6 words changed everything. Eleanor felt them move through the room like something cold under a closed door. Mrs. Vane set down her knife. "Are you suggesting he was pushed?" "I am suggesting nothing yet," said the doctor, plainly irritated by the appetite of ordinary people for swift shapes to place around uncertainty. "I am stating that I am not prepared to simplify matters before I have reason." Miss Marple lifted her gaze to Clara. "My dear, were the cellar steps in regular use?" Clara turned toward her, almost with relief, as though practical questions were preferable to the emotions other people might produce. "Not by the guests. There's a service route through the scullery and down a narrow turn. We keep wine there still, and preserves, and some old account books no one has had the heart to throw away. The floor is uneven. Mr. Bellamy had no business being there at all." "No business," repeated Inspector Hughes gently, "or no known business?" Clara met his eyes. "No known business?" Eleanor had the odd thought that this distinction mattered very much to Miss Marple. Breakfast naturally dissolved after that. No one wished to leave the room first, yet remaining in it became unbearable. Chairs scraped, cups were abandoned half full. The smell of bacon and coffee had taken on a greasy, exhausted quality, and somewhere near the sideboard a strip of toast had burnt unnoticed, lending the room a bitter edge. Eleanor escaped at last into the courtyard by way of the French doors. The air outside had that faint mineral coolness, old stone keeps long after the season ought to have shifted. The courtyard itself was enclosed on 3 sides by the inn's back walls. Brick below, timber above, the beams tar-dark and bowed with age. A climbing rose, long finished flowering, clung to one side in a net of thorns and dry leaves. Water stood in a chipped stone trough near the kitchen entrance. The cobbles underfoot were irregular and glossy in patches where generations had crossed them. Miss Marple joined her a few minutes later with no appearance of haste. "One forgets how oppressive breakfast rooms may become once truth has entered them," she said. "Everyone begins swallowing much more than food." Eleanor gave a brief strained laugh. "Do you truly think it was murder?" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I think at present that a man has died in a place he did not ordinarily go after leaving unfinished something he ordinarily finished. That is enough to make one attentive. Conclusions can be very vulgar when taken too early." She looked down, then not at Eleanor but at the ground. There, near the lip of the step leading from the courtyard to the kitchen passage, one cobblestone sat a shade higher than the others. Not enough for most eyes. Enough for hers. The line of mortar around it had been disturbed recently, and in the narrow groove beside it there clung a thread dark blue, almost black, so fine Eleanor might have taken it for a root if Miss Marple had not stooped, with surprising nimbleness, and touched it with one gloved finger. "Loose?" Eleanor asked. "Not quite loose. Altered," said Miss Marple, "which is a different matter. In St. Mary Mead there was a girl named Elsie Tyler who claimed the church path was dangerous because of tree roots. Everyone believed her because roots are so plausible. It turned out she had been lifting one paving brick herself whenever she wished old Mrs. Partridge to take the long way round and miss the postman." Eleanor stared. Why would anyone do that? Miss Marple straightened. Because old Mrs. Partridge read postcards before handing them over, and Elsie was in correspondence with a young man whom her mother considered unsuitable. People are endlessly ingenious when they feel observed. She turned her head toward the kitchen door. Clara Finch was standing just within, speaking to Inspector Hughes. Her face was in shadow from the passage beyond, but her voice carried faintly. Calm, low, useful. Eleanor found herself saying, almost involuntarily, "She doesn't seem like someone who could be involved in anything dreadful." Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but it sharpened in that curious inward way it had. "Most people who do dreadful things spend years ensuring that they do not seem the sort," she said. "That is rather how they manage it." Eleanor looked back at the raised stone, the thread caught at its side, the worn doorway beyond. She had the unmistakable sensation that the courtyard knew something the house had not yet decided to confess. Then the kitchen door opened wider, and Inspector Hughes looked directly at them. "Miss Marple," he said, "I understand from Miss Finch that you noticed Mr. Bellamy's tea before anyone else thought to wonder at it. I would be obliged if you would tell me exactly what you saw." And Miss Marple, folding her hands lightly over one another, went in as though she had expected the invitation all along. Chapter 3. The Habit of Returning. The kitchen passage had the particular closeness of spaces not meant for guests. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it carried a mingled scent of damp stone, soap that had long ago lost its freshness, and the faint sourness of old wood that had known too many winters without proper heat. The light was uneven. A single bulb had been fixed high in the wall, casting a narrow cone that left the corners in suggestion rather than certainty. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, though she could not have said why. It was not fear, not precisely. Rather the feeling of stepping into a place where events had already occurred without her, and might yet leave traces she did not understand how to read. Miss Marple, by contrast, entered as though she had done so 100 times before. "One always finds these back passages more revealing than the front rooms," she said quietly, as Inspector Hughes guided them along the narrow turn toward the cellar steps. In St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Ellicott's house had a scullery that told one far more about her circumstances than her drawing-room ever could. She entertained very prettily, you know, but the servants' door had a way of sticking in damp weather, and one learned to notice when people avoided it. Inspector Hughes glanced at her with a flicker of interest. "You believe avoidance is significant here?" "My dear Inspector, I believe everything is significant until it proves otherwise," Miss Marple replied gently. "The difficulty lies in not discarding the wrong thing too early." The passage turned sharply, and the air shifted cooler now, and distinctly mineral. Ahead, the cellar steps descended in a narrow spiral that seemed less built than carved into the house by persistence rather than design. The stone edges were worn, though not evenly. Some dips were deeper, as though certain treads had borne more weight than others over time. Dr. Lennox stood at the foot of the stairs, his expression composed but faintly displeased, as though the human tendency toward untidy endings had once again inconvenienced him. "I would prefer not to have half the inn traipsing down here," he said, as they approached. "The gentleman is already removed, but there is no reason to disturb what remains." Inspector Hughes inclined his head. "We shall be brief. Miss Marple has an eye for detail." "Everyone has an eye for detail," said the doctor shortly. "Very few know which details to trust." Miss Marple smiled as though this were a point on which she entirely agreed. Eleanor descended carefully, aware of the way her shoes slipped slightly on the worn stone. The last few steps opened into a low-ceilinged space lined with shelves. Bottles of wine rested in dusty ranks, their labels turned inward or outward with no apparent system. Jars of preserves, plum, quince. Something darker she could not identify stood in neat rows, their lids clouded with age. At the far end, where the passage narrowed again toward a secondary storage alcove, there was a darker patch on the floor, not large, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Eleanor looked away first. "He was found there," said Inspector Hughes not unkindly. "Face down, one arm twisted under him. No sign of struggle that I could see at once, though the position is awkward." Dr. Lennox cleared his throat. "The head injury would be sufficient to cause death, given the angle of impact, but I should prefer to examine him more thoroughly before declaring it the sole cause." Miss Marple had not gone to the darker patch. Instead, she stood halfway between the shelves and the base of the stairs, her gaze moving slowly, not searching exactly, but settling. "One notices," she said after a moment, "that the steps are worn unevenly. These three here," she indicated them with a small movement of her hand, "are much more deeply marked than the others. That suggests regular use, though not by many people. A single person, perhaps, with a consistent habit." Clara Finch, who had followed them down, spoke quietly. "I use the cellar more than anyone else, for the wine, mostly, and the preserves in winter. The staff prefer the other entrance through the yard when they can." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. And Mr. Bellamy would not have had occasion to come here?" "None," Clara said with just the slightest emphasis. "He took his meals upstairs and his papers were kept in his room. He was very particular about that." Inspector Hughes looked at the shelves. "Yet he did come here." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is precisely what makes it interesting." Eleanor found herself speaking, though she had not intended to. Perhaps he heard something, or followed someone. Dr. Lennox gave a faint snort. Or perhaps he lost his footing. "People do that, miss." "Price," Eleanor said. "People lose their footing all the time, Miss Price," the doctor continued. "They do not require elaborate reasons." Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the floor near the base of the steps, not the darker patch, but the stone just beside it. "Of course they do," she said, "but they do not usually leave their tea unfinished beforehand." There was a small silence at that, not empty, but occupied by the weight of the observation. Inspector Hughes shifted his stance. "You place importance on that." "I place importance on interruption," Miss Marple replied. "Habit interrupted is far more telling than habit maintained. In St. Mary Mead there was a woman named Mrs. Bickerton who always locked her pantry at precisely 9 o'clock. Always. When one evening she failed to do so, everyone assumed she had simply forgotten. It turned out she had not forgotten at all. She had been prevented." Clara's gaze moved almost involuntarily toward the stairs. "Prevented," Eleanor echoed. Miss Marple straightened. "Yes, the difference is subtle, but quite important." Inspector Hughes crouched near the darker patch, careful not to disturb it. "If he was prevented, as you suggest, then the question becomes prevented by whom, and why bring him here?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, her tone light, almost conversational. "That depends entirely on whether he came here willingly." Dr. Lennox made a small impatient gesture. "We are drifting into speculation." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "We are distinguishing between two very different sorts of movement. One chooses to go somewhere, or one is induced to do so. The distinction often lies not in the destination, but in what one leaves behind." Eleanor thought of the teacup again, its thin crescent of untouched tea. "Something was left behind," she said quietly. Miss Marple looked at her with approval that was almost imperceptible. "Yes, my dear, something was left behind." Clara stepped forward then, as though drawn by something she could not quite resist. "Inspector, I should mention, Mr. Bellamy did receive a letter yesterday afternoon. I only know because it arrived with the post, and he asked for it to be brought up immediately. He seemed not himself afterwards." Inspector Hughes turned sharply. "Not himself in what way?" Clara hesitated, not long, but long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "He was quieter," she said at last. "More withdrawn. He did not join the others for dinner, which was unusual. He said he had work to attend to." Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in front of her. "A letter can be a very powerful thing," she said, "particularly when it alters one's routine. In St. Mary Mead there was a gentleman, Mr. Langford, who received a letter one Tuesday and changed his entire manner for the rest of the week. Everyone assumed it was business. It was not, of course. It was something much older than that." Inspector Hughes rose. "We shall need to see that letter." Clara inclined her head. "Of course. His room has not been disturbed." Eleanor felt a faint tightening in her chest. The pieces, such as they were, did not yet form a picture, but they pressed against one another in ways that suggested they might. Miss Marple took one last look around the cellar. "The thing about places like this," she said softly, "is that they remember us, even when people do not. One sees it in the wear of the steps, the placement of the shelves, the small adjustments made over time. Nothing here is accidental, not even what appears to be." She turned then, beginning to ascend the stairs with careful steps. "And so," she added, almost as an afterthought, "one must ask oneself not what happened here, but what was expected to happen." Eleanor followed her up, the air growing warmer with each step. Behind them the cellar remained as it was quiet, unchanged, holding its arrangement of stone and shadow. But the sense persisted, stronger now that whatever had occurred there had not been sudden. It had been prepared, and someone long before Arthur Bellamy ever set foot on those stairs had known exactly where he would fall. Chapter 4. A very reasonable explanation. Arthur Bellamy's room was on the second floor at the start of a narrow passage where the carpet thinned and the floorboards beneath declared themselves more honestly. The door stood half open when they arrived, not carelessly so, but with that cautious incompleteness that suggested someone had gone in, looked, and chosen not to close things entirely again. Inspector Hughes paused at the threshold, then pushed the door gently with 2 fingers. "One prefers rooms to tell their story before one interrupts it further," he said, almost apologetically. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite right. Rooms are rather like people in that respect. They reveal more when not directly questioned." Eleanor followed them in, though she felt again that small hesitation, the sense that she was stepping into a private arrangement that had, until very recently, belonged wholly to another mind. The room itself was orderly in the particular way of a man who believes that order reflects virtue. The bed was made tightly, the counterpane smoothed flat with no allowance for casual use. A small writing desk stood by the window, its surface cleared except for a leather blotter, a pen aligned precisely along its edge, and a single folded sheet of paper placed squarely at the centre. It was not a cluttered room, it was a deliberate one. Clara Finch moved just inside the door, her hands again loosely folded. "We have not touched anything since the inspector asked us not to. Mr. Bellamy valued his privacy, and I thought it best to preserve things as they were." Dr. Lennox, who had little patience for such niceties, stepped directly to the window and opened it a fraction. "The air in here has that stale quality of a room occupied by a man who sits still for too long. One can almost measure temperament by ventilation." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. Fresh air is often avoided by those who prefer not to have their thoughts disturbed." Inspector Hughes crossed to the desk. He did not touch the paper immediately. Instead, he looked at its position, its alignment, the way it had been folded. "Miss Finch," he said, "you mentioned a letter." "Yes," Claire replied. "That arrived yesterday afternoon. This must be it." Miss Marple's gaze had already settled on the paper, not eagerly, but with that quiet attentiveness that seemed to absorb rather than seek. "One observes," she said gently, "that it has been folded again after being opened, not quite along the original crease. That suggests it was read more than once." Inspector Hughes glanced at her, then at the paper. "You notice these things often, I imagine." "Oh, one notices habits," Miss Marple replied, "and deviations from them." He unfolded the letter carefully. Eleanor watched his face as he read. It did not change dramatically. There was no theatrical reaction, no sudden tightening. But something in the stillness of his expression altered subtly, like a surface disturbed just beneath visibility. "Well?" Dr. Lennox asked, with restrained impatience. Inspector Hughes handed the letter to him. "It appears Mr. Bellamy was being reminded of a matter from some years ago, a financial arrangement, perhaps. The tone is not overtly threatening, but there is implication." Dr. Lennox read more quickly, then gave a short, dissatisfied exhale. "Vague, entirely vague. If this is meant to frighten, it does so without committing to anything one could act upon." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "May I?" Inspector Hughes handed her the letter. Eleanor watched her read it carefully, line by line. Her expression did not alter. Only her left hand again pressed lightly against her right, the thumb finding that same place at the knuckle. "It seems unpleasant," she said at last, "though I cannot say I understand it fully." Miss Marple had moved slightly closer to the desk, not intrusively. but within the orbit of the letter. "May I?" she asked, her tone so mild it might almost have been declined by someone less attentive. Inspector Hughes nodded. She took the paper between her fingers, holding it lightly, as though it might reveal something through touch as much as sight. "Yes," she murmured after a moment. "Unpleasant, certainly, though what interests one is not what is written, but what is not." Eleanor leaned slightly forward. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded the letter again, this time along the exact original crease. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman, Mrs. Fowler, who wrote the most polite letters you could imagine. Never a harsh word, never anything one could object to. And yet, the people who received them always seemed altered afterwards." It was only later that we understood that her true meaning lay entirely in what she omitted. She placed the letter back on the desk, precisely where it had been. "This is rather like that. It tells Mr. Bellamy just enough to remind him of something he would prefer not to recall, and leaves the rest to his imagination." Inspector Hughes nodded slowly. "Which might explain his behaviour last evening." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it might." Eleanor crossed the room then, drawn toward the window. From there she could see the courtyard below the uneven cobblestones, the narrow entrance to the kitchen passage, the trough with its still water. And there, just at the edge where the stones met the wall, she noticed something she had not seen before. "Inspector," she said quietly, "there's something below." They joined her at the window. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a slight darkening along the line of the wall. But as Eleanor leaned closer, she saw it more clearly, a faint mark, not quite a stain, running along the base where the cobbles met the brick. Miss Marple did not lean forward. She merely observed. "One often finds," she said softly, "that things which are out of place do not advertise themselves. They simply remain, waiting to be noticed by someone who has no reason to ignore them." Inspector Hughes straightened. "We shall have a look at that in a moment." Clara had not come to the window. She remained by the desk, her gaze fixed not on the letter now, but on the pen lying beside it. "Mr. Bellamy wrote quite a great deal," she said, as though the thought had just occurred to her. "He was always making notes. Lists, mostly. Small things, accounts, reminders. He liked to keep things in order." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "Did he, my dear?" she asked gently. "Yes," Clara said. "He found comfort in it, I think." Miss Marple's eyes moved to the blotter. There were impressions there, faint but present. The sort left when one writes on a sheet of paper placed over another. "One might expect, then," Miss Marple said, almost idly, "that there would be some trace of his last thoughts here, even if the paper itself has been removed." Inspector Hughes stepped closer, examining the blotter. "Perhaps," he said. "We shall see what can be made of it." Eleanor felt the room tighten again, not with fear, but with that growing sense that each small ordinary detail was beginning to shift slightly out of alignment. The letter, the unfinished tea, the cellar steps, the altered cobblestone. None of it is dramatic, none of it is obvious. And yet Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her gaze moving once more around the room. "The difficulty," she said softly, "is that everything here has a very reasonable explanation, and one always prefers a reasonable explanation because it allows one to stop thinking." She looked at the door, then back at the desk. "But when too many reasonable explanations present themselves at once," she added with a faint, almost regretful smile, "it is often because something unreasonable has been very carefully arranged to appear otherwise." Inspector Hughes folded his arms. "Then we must decide," he said. "Which explanation is the one that does not quite fit?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "That is always the place to begin." And on the desk, the letter lay once more as it had been found, precise, controlled, and just sufficiently incomplete to ensure that whatever truth it concealed would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 5. Everything that was not said. Lunch was announced with a formality that felt almost defiant. Clara Finch had taken particular care over it. One could see that at once. The table was laid with fresh linen, the cutlery polished to a brightness that reflected not merely light but intention, and the food itself cold meats, salads arranged in careful geometry, bread still faintly warm suggested a deliberate insistence that life should proceed. Yet it did not proceed naturally. Eleanor Price found herself seated between Mrs. Vane, and a man she had scarcely spoken to before a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Pettigrew, whose habit of beginning sentences as though they were lectures had not, until now, been particularly noticeable. "Of course," he was saying, in that tone which assumed attention whether it had been granted or not, "one must consider the statistical likelihood of accidents in environments such as these. Old buildings present hazards, irregular surfaces, poor lighting. It is entirely reasonable that a man might misstep." Mrs. Vane adjusted her napkin with delicate precision. "It is always interesting," she said, her voice low and smooth, "how quickly reason appears when it is required. It arrives almost before one has decided what one wishes to believe." Mr. Pettigrew blinked at her, then cleared his throat. "I am not speaking of belief, madam. I am speaking of probability." "Which is so often shaped by belief," Mrs. Vane replied, lifting her glass but not drinking from it. Across the table, Mr. Harding had abandoned any attempt at restraint. "I say, this is all getting rather excessive, isn't it?" he declared, carving into a slice of ham with more force than necessary. "Man goes down a set of dodgy stairs, hits his head unfortunate, certainly, but now we're all behaving as though we've wandered into one of those sensational stories people are so fond of. There's no need to turn everything into a mystery." Miss Marple, who had taken only a small portion of salad, looked at him with mild interest. "My dear Mr. Harding," she said, "mysteries are not things one turns on or off. They simply exist, or they do not. One may ignore them, of course, but that does not make them disappear." He gave a short laugh. "Well, I for one intend to ignore this one. Much healthier approach." "Health," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "is often a matter of what one chooses not to notice." Eleanor glanced at Clara Finch, who was moving between the tables with her usual composure. If anything, she seemed more attentive than before, anticipating needs before they were expressed, refilling glasses at precisely the moment they were noticed to be low, smoothing over small awkwardnesses before they could develop. It was, Eleanor thought, a performance of reassurance, and it was remarkably effective. "Miss Finch," Mr. Pettigrew called, raising his voice slightly, "you must not allow yourself to be troubled by all this. These things happen. Buildings of this age cannot expect modern safety standards." Clara smiled at him, her expression calm, almost grateful. "You are very kind, Mr. Pettigrew. We do our best to ensure the safety of our guests, but of course one cannot control everything." "Precisely," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "Precisely." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Clara for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, as though the thought had just occurred to her, "there was a woman named Mrs. Denham who prided herself on managing every detail of her household. Nothing escaped her attention. Everything was accounted for. And yet," she paused, adjusting her fork slightly on the plate, "it was precisely that attention to detail which allowed something rather important to go unnoticed. Because everyone assumed that if she had not mentioned it, it must not matter." Mrs. Vane looked up. "And did it matter?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It mattered very much indeed." There was a small silence, not the empty kind, but one filled with the quiet rearrangement of thought. Eleanor found herself studying Clara more closely now, not her movements, which were as efficient as ever, but the spaces between them, the moments when she was not actively engaged in some task. There was, she realized, no such moment. Clara was always doing something, always occupied, always present. It was, Eleanor thought suddenly, rather like the courtyard the way it held its shape not through stillness, but through constant small adjustments. Inspector Hughes entered the room then, his presence altering the atmosphere at once not dramatically but decisively. "Miss Finch," he said, approaching her. "A word, if you please." "Of course," Clara replied, setting down the tray she carried. They moved a little apart, not far enough to be private, but far enough to suggest that privacy was intended. Eleanor watched them without appearing to do so. "You mentioned Mr. Bellamy's habits," the inspector said quietly. "His routines. I would like to understand them more clearly." Clara inclined her head. "He rose early, took tea in the morning room at 7:30, breakfast at 8, unless he had work to attend to. He walked occasionally, though not regularly. He spent a great deal of time in his room." "And yesterday?" Hughes asked. "Yesterday was different," Clara said. "After receiving the letter, he did not follow his usual pattern. He remained in his room for most of the afternoon. He did not dine with the other guests. He asked for a tray to be sent up." "Who took it?" One of the maids, Clara replied. Sarah. She said he seemed distracted, not unwell, but preoccupied. Inspector Hughes nodded slowly. And this morning? Clara hesitated not long, but long enough. This morning, he was seen in the morning room. His tea was served. After that, she spread her hands slightly. No one seems to have noticed his movements. Miss Marple, who had been listening without appearing to listen, spoke gently. That is curious, is it not? That a man so regular in his habits should become, for a brief period, entirely unobserved. Clara turned to her, her expression still composed. It is a busy establishment, Miss Marple. People come and go. One cannot account for every moment. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And yet one often finds that certain moments that matter most are precisely the ones no one quite sees. Inspector Hughes looked between them. Miss Marple, you believe someone saw more than they have said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe, Inspector, that people often say exactly what they believe to be safe. It is what they do not say that requires a little more attention. Eleanor felt a faint tightening in her chest again. The conversation seemed to hover there, balanced between what was known and what was not yet spoken. Mr. Harding, who had been watching with increasing impatience, pushed back his chair. Well, I refuse to spend the afternoon being interrogated like a criminal, he declared. I shall take a walk. Fresh air is the only sensible response to all this. Inspector Hughes turned to him. I would prefer, sir, that all guests remain on the premises for the present. Harding frowned. Surely that's unnecessary. I have nothing to do with any of this. That may be so, Hughes said evenly, but until we understand what happened, it is necessary. Harding opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Very well, he said, though I find it excessive. Miss Marple watched him sit down again. One always finds, she said softly, that those who are most certain of their own position are often the least inclined to examine it. Eleanor looked at her. Do you think he's hiding something? She asked quietly. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. Oh no, my dear. Mr. Harding is hiding exactly what he appears to be hiding, which is nothing at all. That is why he is so comfortable. She lifted her glass, taking a small sip at last. The difficulty lies elsewhere, she added. Eleanor followed her gaze across the room, to where Clara Finch stood, speaking calmly to Mrs. Vane, her hands once again composed, her expression perfectly arranged. Everything about her suggested order, control, reliability. And yet Eleanor thought of the courtyard, the altered stone, the thread caught at its edge, small things, easily overlooked. Miss Marple set down her glass. The trouble with very reasonable explanations, she said quietly, is that they leave no room for the one thing that cannot be explained at all. Eleanor leaned slightly forward. And what is that? Miss Marple's eyes moved just briefly toward Clara. Why, she said gently, something was done at all. Across the room, Clara Finch smiled at something Mrs. Vane had said, and for the first time Eleanor wondered not what Clara was doing, but what she had already done. Chapter 6. The Letter That Did Not Speak. The afternoon settled into that strained quiet which follows too much politeness. Guests dispersed, though not far. Some took to the sitting room, where the chairs had been drawn closer together under the pretence of comfort. Others lingered along the corridor, pausing at windows as though the view might justify their stillness. Eleanor found herself returning, almost without decision, to the small morning room where the teacup had first drawn Miss Marple's attention. It had been cleared. The table was set as it ought to be, a fresh cup, fresh saucer, no faint crescent of untouched tea to suggest interruption. Yet Eleanor could not look at it without remembering precisely how it had been before. Miss Marple sat near the window, her hands folded lightly in her lap. One always finds, she said, as Eleanor approached, that tidying is a most deceptive activity. It creates the appearance of resolution without altering the substance of what has occurred. Eleanor sat opposite her. It feels wrong somehow, as though something has been erased. Oh, nothing important is ever erased, Miss Marple replied gently. It merely changes form. The difficulty is in recognizing it once it has done so. Inspector Hughes entered then, carrying the letter from Mr. Bellamy's desk. It had been placed within a thin envelope now, though not sealed. I thought you might care to look at this again, Miss Marple, he said. There are one or two aspects that trouble me. Miss Marple inclined her head. Trouble is often an excellent guide, Inspector. It points one toward what has not yet been understood. He handed her the letter. Eleanor watched as Miss Marple unfolded it, not hurriedly, but with that same careful attention she had shown before. The paper itself was ordinary enough cream, slightly rough to the touch, the sort one might purchase without remark. The writing, however, was precise, not elegant exactly, but controlled. Each letter formed with deliberate care, as though the writer had wished to avoid revealing anything beyond the words themselves. Miss Marple read silently, then read again. "Yes," she murmured, "it is very well done." Inspector Hughes frowned slightly. "Well done?" "Oh, yes," she said. "It says exactly what it intends to say and nothing more. That is quite difficult to achieve." Eleanor leaned forward. "But what does it mean?" Miss Marple glanced at her with a small, almost apologetic smile. "My dear, it means precisely what it says. That Mr. Bellamy was reminded of a matter from the past, and that this matter had not, as he perhaps believed, been entirely concluded. That doesn't help us much," Eleanor said. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "it helps us a great deal. It tells us that the writer wished to remind, not to threaten. That is a very different intention." Inspector Hughes folded his arms. "You believe the writer did not intend harm?" "I believe the writer intended a reaction," Miss Marple said. "What that reaction might lead to is another matter entirely." She turned the paper slightly, examining it from a different angle. "One notices, too," she added, "that the ink is quite fresh. It has not had time to settle fully into the fibres of the paper. That suggests it was written not long before it was sent." Eleanor looked at the letter more closely. Though she could see no such detail herself. "Could it have been written here?" she asked. Inspector Hughes considered this. "It is possible. We have not yet examined the writing materials in the house." Miss Marple folded the letter again, aligning the crease with quiet precision. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a gentleman, Mr. Larkin, who prided himself on his ability to imitate handwriting. He considered it a harmless amusement. Quite a clever man in his way. It was only when a letter appeared that could not have been written by the person whose hand it resembled that we began to understand the extent of his creativity." Inspector Hughes looked at her sharply. "You think this letter may not be what it appears to be?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think it is exactly what it appears to be. Which is why one must consider the possibility that its appearance has been very carefully chosen." Eleanor felt a faint shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. "Someone wanted him to read it in a certain way," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "and they were successful." Clara Finch entered the room then, her presence once again bringing with it that subtle shift, an easing of tension that was almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "I thought you might care for some tea." Her voice was as warm as ever, her manner composed. Miss Marple looked up at her with gentle appreciation. "How very kind, my dear. One always finds that tea improves one's ability to think clearly, provided, of course, that one finishes it." Clara's hand paused for the smallest moment as she set down the tray. "I shall make sure you do," she said, with a lightness that did not quite reach her eyes. Eleanor noticed it then, not the pause itself, but the effort that followed it. Clara poured the tea with steady hands, placing each cup before them with exact care. The movement was practiced, almost automatic, and yet there was something in the way she placed Miss Marple's cup. Not wrong, not obvious. But Miss Marple noticed it. Eleanor saw it in the slight tilt of her head, the brief narrowing of her eyes. Clara stepped back. "If there is anything else you require, please do let me know." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said. "You have been most attentive." Clara smiled, then left the room. For a moment no one spoke. Then Miss Marple reached for her cup but did not drink. Instead, she looked at it. "Inspector," she said quietly, "would you be so kind as to tell me who prepared the tea this morning for Mr. Bellamy?" Inspector Hughes blinked slightly at the question. "I believe Miss Finch oversaw it, as she does most things." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I thought as much." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Do you think of tea?" Miss Marple raised her hand gently. "My dear, one must never jump to conclusions. It is most unwise." She lifted the cup, holding it just below her lips, but still did not drink. "One must simply observe," she continued, "and allow the pattern to reveal itself." Inspector Hughes leaned forward. "And what pattern do you see?" Miss Marple set the cup down again, untouched. "A very careful one," she said softly. Eleanor looked at the tea, then at Miss Marple. "Careful how?" Miss Marple's gaze moved to the door, where Clara had just disappeared. "Careful enough," she said, "to appear entirely natural." There was a small silence. Then Miss Marple added, almost to herself, "And that is always the most dangerous kind." Chapter 7. The Woman Who Poured. Too carefully by late afternoon, the inn had settled into a quieter rhythm, though not a natural one. It was the sort of quiet that comes when people are listening for something they cannot quite name. Even the floorboards seemed to creak with restraint, as though aware that noise might disturb more than comfort. Eleanor found herself in the sitting room, though she had no clear memory of deciding to go there. The room was long and narrow, with 2 tall windows overlooking the courtyard. A faint scent of lavender clung to the upholstery, not fresh, but the sort that lingers from sachets long since replaced. The fire, though unnecessary for warmth, had been lit anyway. Its low crackle provided a kind of cover for the silence. Mrs. Vane sat near the hearth, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She appeared at ease, though Eleanor had begun to understand that such appearances were often the least reliable. "It is remarkable," Mrs. Vane said, without looking up, "how quickly a place reveals its true character under strain. One sees things more clearly when people are trying not to be seen at all." Eleanor sat opposite her. "Do you think that's what's happening here?" Mrs. Vane smiled faintly. "I think it is always what is happening. It simply becomes more visible at certain moments." She turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting toward the door. "Miss Finch, for example." "Is being very careful," Eleanor hesitated. "Careful in what way?" "In every way," Mrs. Vane replied, which is, in itself, rather telling. Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Clara Finch entered, carrying a small tray. Her movements were as composed as ever, her expression calm, her voice warm. "I thought some tea might be welcome," she said. "The afternoon can feel rather long otherwise." She set the tray down on the low table between them, arranging the cups with quiet precision. Eleanor watched her closely now, not openly, but with the sort of attention that had begun to feel almost instinctive. Clara poured the tea. The movement was flawless. Too flawless. Each cup was filled to the same level. Each was placed at exactly the right distance from the edge of the table. Even the angle of the handles was aligned subtly, but unmistakably. Miss Marple entered just then, as though summoned by the moment itself. "How very pleasant," she said, taking a seat beside Eleanor. "One always appreciates a well-made cup of tea." Clara smiled. "I will try." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "you do try." There was something in her tone, something so slight it might easily have been missed. But Eleanor heard it, and she thought, so did Clara. Clara's hand paused briefly on the teapot. Then she set it down. "Please," she said, "do enjoy." Miss Marple lifted her cup, but once again she did not drink. Instead, she held it lightly, her gaze resting on the surface of the tea. "One finds," she said, almost idly, "that the act of pouring tea can reveal a great deal about a person. Some pour without thinking, others measure carefully. And then there are those who adjust." Clara's smile did not falter. "Adjust?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "to ensure that everything appears exactly as it should." Mrs. Vane leaned slightly forward. "And is that not a virtue?" "Oh, certainly," said Miss Marple, "in most circumstances." She set the cup down again, untouched. But not all. A small silence followed, not empty, but filled with something that had not yet been named. Eleanor felt it press against her thoughts. Clara moved to the window, her back to them now. "The inspector will wish to speak with each of you this evening," she said. "Just to clarify a few details. It is quite routine." "Of course," Mrs. Vane replied smoothly. "We shall all be most helpful." Clara nodded, then turned slightly. "For my part, I shall do everything I can to assist," she added. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. "I have no doubt about that, my dear," she said softly. Clara held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she left the room. Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "There's something wrong," she said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "there is." Mrs. Vane looked between them. "You speak as though you already know what it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no," she said. "One never knows anything so quickly. That would be most unwise." She folded her hands in her lap. "One simply observes patterns," she continued, "and wait to see where they lead." Eleanor leaned forward. "And where do they lead?" Miss Marple looked at her. "To intention," she said. Eleanor frowned slightly. "You mean someone meant for this to happen?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Quite deliberately." She turned her gaze toward the window where the courtyard lay in quiet stillness. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman named Mrs. Cartwright who was known for her hospitality. She never forgot a detail. Always the right tea, the right cup, the right arrangement. It was considered a great kindness." She paused. "But it turned out," she added softly, "that her kindness was very selective." Eleanor felt a chill not of temperature but of understanding. "You think, Clara?" Miss Marple raised her hand gently. "My dear, one must be very careful not to accuse without cause. It is most unfair." She looked again at the untouched cup before her. "But one must also be careful not to ignore what is plainly before one's eyes." Inspector Hughes entered the room at that moment, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple," he said, "I have just come from the cellar again. There is something I think you should see." Miss Marple rose at once. "Of course, Inspector," she said. Eleanor stood as well, her heart quickening. As they moved toward the door, Miss Marple glanced once more at the table, at the cups, at the tea, and then, very quietly, she said, "It is always the small things." They followed Inspector Hughes into the corridor. Behind them the tea sat untouched, and in the stillness of the room the careful arrangement remained exactly as it had been left perfect, and entirely unnatural. Chapter 8. What the stone refused to forget. The courtyard had altered again. It was not something one could easily point to, no chair moved, no object misplaced, but the space felt unsettled. The late afternoon light had shifted lower, catching along the uneven edges of the cobblestone so that each slight rise and dip cast its own narrow shadow. What had seemed merely irregular before now appeared deliberate, as though the ground itself had been arranged to conceal something rather than reveal it. Inspector Hughes stood near the kitchen step, his hands behind his back. "I asked that no one come out here for the last hour," he said, as Miss Marple and Eleanor approached. "I wanted to be certain of what I was seeing before I mentioned it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite right. One must never disturb a thing before one has understood its condition." Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze moving instinctively to the raised cobblestone Miss Marple had noticed earlier. It was no longer raised, or rather it had been adjusted again. She frowned. "It's different." "Yes," said the inspector quietly. "That is precisely the point." Miss Marple did not step forward immediately. She remained where she was, observing not the stone itself but the arrangement around it. "One finds," she said softly, "that when something is altered more than once, it is rarely by accident. Accidents do not tend to correct themselves." Inspector Hughes nodded. "I had one of the constables mark the position of the stone earlier. When I returned just now, it had shifted. Not by much, but enough." Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. "But no one's been out here," she said. "Not officially," Hughes replied. Miss Marple moved forward then, her steps careful but unhurried. She knelt slightly, not fully, but enough to bring her closer to the surface of the stones. "Yes," she murmured. "There it is." Eleanor followed her gaze. At the edge of the stone, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was a faint line. Not a crack exactly, but a seam, and within that seam, a thread. The same dark thread Miss Marple had noticed before, but now it had been pressed deeper, almost hidden. Miss Marple reached out, touching it lightly with one gloved finger. "Someone has been here," she said. Inspector Hughes's expression tightened. "Recently?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Very recently." Eleanor looked around the courtyard, her eyes scanning the walls, the windows above, the narrow entrance to the kitchen passage. "But why?" she asked. "Why move it again?" Miss Marple rose slowly. "To conceal something that had not yet been fully concealed," she said. Inspector Hughes stepped closer. "You believe the stone was altered before Mr. Bellamy's fall, and then again afterwards?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "which suggests that whatever purpose it served was not entirely complete." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp clarity. It wasn't just a loose stone, she said. It was meant to be loose. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Exactly, my dear. Inspector Hughes crouched down, examining the seam more closely. There's something beneath it, he said. With careful hands, he shifted the stone, not lifting it entirely, but enough to reveal what lay underneath. A small recess. And within it, a folded scrap of paper. Eleanor drew in a breath. Miss Marple did not move. Do not touch it, she said gently. Let the inspector do so. Hughes nodded, removing the paper with deliberate care. He unfolded it slowly. There was writing. Not much, just a few lines, but enough. His expression changed not dramatically, but unmistakably. This, he said quietly, is in the same hand as the letter. Eleanor stepped closer. What does it say? Inspector Hughes hesitated, then read aloud. 7:30. The cellar. Come alone. It must be settled. A silence followed. Not empty, but full. Eleanor felt it settle over them, pressing against the edges of her understanding. He was called there, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. Invited. Inspector Hughes folded the paper again. This changes things, he said. Miss Marple looked at him. No, she said gently. It clarifies them. Eleanor frowned. But if he was invited, then he went willingly. Yes, Miss Marple said, which is quite different from being forced. Inspector Hughes straightened. Then whoever wrote this arranged the meeting. Indeed, Miss Marple replied. Eleanor's thoughts moved quickly now, assembling pieces that had until now remained separate. The letter, the note, the cellar, it was all planned. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, very carefully planned. Inspector Hughes looked toward the inn. And the person who moved the stone again afterwards was trying to hide this. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Eleanor felt a sudden, uneasy recognition. They didn't want it found, she said. No, Miss Marple agreed. Not yet. Inspector Hughes turned to her. Not yet. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the windows above the rooms overlooking the courtyard. One often finds, she said softly, that when something is hidden but not destroyed, it is because the person who hid it believes they may need it again. Eleanor felt a chill. You mean this note wasn't just evidence? It was part of something ongoing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, my dear, she said. Very much so. Inspector Hughes looked down at the paper in his hand. Then we must find out who wrote it, he said. Miss Marple turned her gaze back to the stone. I think, she said gently, we already know more than we realize. Eleanor looked at her. You do? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes moving once more over the courtyard, the stones, the walls, the narrow passage leading inside. All arrangements, she said at last, require 3 things. Inspector Hughes glanced at her. And those are? Opportunity, Miss Marple replied. Knowledge. And control. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Control, she repeated. Yes, Miss Marple said. Her gaze moved quietly, precisely toward the kitchen door. And one must always ask, she added, who in this house possesses all 3? The door remained closed. The courtyard is silent, but the pattern was no longer hidden, only incomplete. And somewhere within the inn, the person who had written that note, I was waiting to see whether it would be found. Chapter 9. What the house already knew. The interviews began at 6. Not formally announced, not gathered into a single room with solemnity and order, but conducted instead in the small parlour off the main corridor one at a time, with the door half closed and the low murmur of voices filtering out into the passage. It was a quiet method, almost gentle, and for that very reason, Eleanor thought, far more effective. She waited her turn on a narrow bench beneath a framed print of a hunting scene, in which the hounds appeared far more certain of their purpose than the riders. From where she sat she could see the edge of the parlour door and, beyond it, a portion of the small round table, where Miss Marple now sat with Inspector Hughes. Their figures were partly obscured, but their voices carried Miss Marple soft and measured, the inspector's lower and more deliberate. Only that it was done with intention, Miss Marple was saying, and that intention, one finds, rarely disguises itself entirely. It leaves small traces, habits, preferences, choices that appear trivial but are anything but, Inspector Hughes replied, though Eleanor could not quite catch the words. A chair moved inside, then the door opened. Mrs. Vane emerged, her expression composed, though her eyes held a faint brightness that had not been there before. She passed Eleanor with a small nod. "My dear," she said quietly, "they ask very reasonable questions. One finds oneself answering rather more than one intended." Eleanor rose. "I imagine that's the point," she said. Mrs. Vane smiled faintly. "Indeed." Eleanor entered the parlour. It was a small room, lined with shelves, that held more decorative objects than books. A faint smell of polish lingered in the air. The window was half open, allowing in the muted sounds of the courtyard, distant but present. Miss Marple sat near the window, her hands folded lightly in her lap. Inspector Hughes stood beside the table, a small notebook open before him. "Miss Price," he said, "thank you for your patience. If you would be so good as to sit—" Eleanor did so, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Miss Marple looked at her with gentle warmth. "You have been most observant, my dear," she said. "One often finds that those who notice small things are of great assistance in matters such as these." Eleanor felt a faint flush rise to her cheeks. "I'm not sure I've noticed anything useful," she said. "Oh, usefulness is often a matter of perspective," Miss Marple replied. "One may not recognise the value of an observation until much later." Inspector Hughes cleared his throat. "Miss Price, I would like you to tell me what you observed this morning in the breakfast room, particularly anything unusual." Eleanor hesitated not from uncertainty, but from the sudden awareness that what she said might matter more than she'd realised. "The tea," she said. "It was left unfinished." "Yes," Hughes said. "And what did you make of that at the time?" "I didn't think much of it," Eleanor admitted. "Not until Miss Marple mentioned it. Then it seemed wrong, as though something had interrupted him." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Interruption," she murmured. "Yes," Eleanor continued. "And then later, in the courtyard, the stone. It had been moved, not just once, but twice." Inspector Hughes nodded. "You saw the thread?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "It was caught in the seam, and then it was pressed deeper, almost hidden." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her. "One often finds," she said softly, "that when something is hidden imperfectly, it is because the person hiding it is under some pressure. Time, perhaps, or fear." Eleanor felt a faint unease. "Do you think they knew we would find it?" she asked. Miss Marple considered this. "I think," she said slowly, "that they hoped it would not be found too soon." Inspector Hughes looked up from his notes. "Why delay?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "timing is everything in such matters. One must arrange not only what happens, but when it is understood." Eleanor's thoughts moved quickly. "The note in the stone," she said. "It was meant to bring him to the cellar." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "At a specific time." 7:30, Eleanor said. Inspector Hughes nodded. "Which corresponds with the time the staff were occupied with evening preparations. The kitchen would have been busy. The corridors are less observed." Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. So whoever arranged it knew the routine. "Quite so," Miss Marple said. Inspector Hughes closed his notebook. "Thank you, Miss Price. That will be all for now." Eleanor rose but hesitated. "There's something else," she said. Both turned to her. "It's Clara," she said quietly. "She's very careful. About everything. The tea, the way she moves, the way she answers questions. It's all precise." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Yes," she said gently. "It is." Eleanor swallowed. "Is that important?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, everything is important. The difficulty lies in knowing what it signifies." Eleanor left the room, her mind unsettled. In the corridor she found Mr. Harding pacing. "Well?" he demanded. "What did they ask you?" "The same as everyone else, I imagine," Eleanor said. He snorted. "This is all nonsense. A man falls down some stairs and suddenly we're all suspects in some elaborate scheme." Eleanor looked at him. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. He hesitated just for a moment. "Well, it's the most reasonable explanation," he said. Eleanor thought of Miss Marple's words. Too many reasonable explanations. She moved past him. Further down the corridor, Clara Finch stood by the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill. She was looking out into the courtyard, the same courtyard where the stone had been altered, where the note had been hidden. She turned as Eleanor approached. "Miss Price," she said, "I hope the inspector did not trouble you too much." "No," Eleanor replied. "Not at all," Clara smiled. "These things can be unsettling, but I assure you we shall have everything resolved very soon." Eleanor looked at her. There was something in the way she said it. Not hopeful, not uncertain, certain. "You seem very sure," Eleanor said. Clara's smile did not change. "One must be," she said. "In a place like this, uncertainty can be damaging." Eleanor felt a faint chill. "And what if the truth is worse than uncertainty?" she asked. Clara's eyes held hers for a moment. "Truth," she said quietly, "is only ever as difficult as one allows it to be." She turned back to the window. Eleanor stood there for a moment longer watching her. Then she moved away. At the end of the corridor, Miss Marple stood alone. She was looking not at the courtyard, but at the floor, at the worn pattern of the carpet, the way it had been pressed down over time by countless footsteps. "You see," she said softly without turning, "houses remember. Not in the way people do, but in the way they are used, where people walk, where they pause, where they avoid." Eleanor came to stand beside her. "And what does this house remember?" she asked. Miss Marple looked up. "That someone here," she said, "has been moving very carefully for a very long time." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "And now?" she asked. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the parlour door, where Inspector Hughes still sat within. "Now," she said gently, "they must decide whether to continue being careful or to act." A small silence followed. Then Miss Marple added, almost to herself, "And it is always at that moment that one learns who they truly are." Chapter 10. The moment that required an answer. Dinner was served later than usual. Clara Finch explained it as a matter of necessity. The kitchen had been disrupted. The staff unsettled, and certain arrangements had required adjustment. The explanation was perfectly reasonable. No one questioned it. And yet, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that the delay had not been accidental at all. It allowed time for what she could not yet say. The dining room had been arranged with particular care. Candles had been placed at intervals along the table, their light softening the edges of the room, making it more intimate, more contained. The windows reflected only darkness now. The courtyard beyond had disappeared entirely, leaving the interior suspended in its own quiet enclosure. Eleanor took her seat, aware of the subtle tension in the room, not overt, not spoken, but present in the way people moved, in the way they avoided one another's eyes. Miss Marple sat at the far end of the table. Her posture relaxed, her expression mild. Too mild, Eleanor thought. Inspector Hughes was present as well, though he did not sit. Instead, he remained near the sideboard, observing. Clara moved between them all as she always had, composed, attentive, entirely in control. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "I know the day has been unusual. I hope dinner will offer some comfort." Her voice was steady, reassuring. Eleanor watched her closely. There was no visible strain, no sign of fear, only that same careful precision. Too careful. Dinner began. For a time there was conversation light, almost forced but present. Mr. Harding spoke of trivial matters with exaggerated enthusiasm. Mrs. Vane responded with polite interest. Mr. Pettigrew offered observations that sounded like conclusions, though they were not. Miss Marple said very little. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, her attention not on the food but on the room. Eleanor followed her gaze. Clara moved from place to place, attending to each guest in turn, pouring wine, refilling water, adjusting plates, always moving, always doing, never still. And then she poured the wine for Miss Marple. The movement was perfect, measured, controlled. But Miss Marple noticed. Eleanor saw it in the slightest shift of her expression, the faintest narrowing of her eyes. Clara set the bottle down. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" she asked. Miss Marple looked up at her. "My dear," she said gently, "you are most attentive." Clara smiled. "One must be." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "one must." There was a pause, not the empty kind, but one filled with something that had not yet been spoken. Then Miss Marple set down her fork. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational, "I believe we have reached the point where it would be most helpful to consider what has not yet been addressed." The room stilled. Inspector Hughes stepped forward. "And what would that be?" he asked. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly in her lap. "The question of control," she said. Clara did not move, but something in the air shifted. Eleanor felt it. Miss Marple continued. "We have established that Mr. Bellamy was a man of habit, that his routine was consistent, predictable, and under ordinary circumstances unlikely to be altered." Inspector Hughes nodded. "Yes. And yet," Miss Marple went on, "his routine was altered. He received a letter. He was invited by means of a note to the cellar, and there he met his death." Clara's expression remained unchanged. Miss Marple's gaze moved to her. "Such an arrangement requires three things," she said: opportunity, knowledge, and control. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Opportunity to deliver the letter, to place the note, to ensure that Mr. Bellamy would be alone at the appointed time. She paused. Knowledge of his habits, his routines, his preferences, the layout of the house, the condition of the cellar steps. Another pause. And control over the environment, over the timing, over the smallest details that might otherwise introduce uncertainty. The room was very still now. No one spoke. Miss Marple looked at Clara. "My dear," she said softly, "you possess all three." Eleanor felt the words land not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that made them impossible to ignore. Clara did not react immediately. She stood very still. Then she smiled. It was the same smile she had worn all day. Warm, composed, perfect. "I'm afraid I don't understand," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh, I think you do," she replied gently. Inspector Hughes stepped forward. "Miss Finch," he said, "we have evidence that the meeting in the cellar was arranged. The note was hidden in the courtyard, then concealed again. The letter was written recently, likely within this house, and Mr. Bellamy's routine was altered in a very specific way." Clara's gaze moved between them. "And you believe I am responsible for all of this?" she asked. Her tone was calm, almost curious. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe, my dear, that you have been very careful," she said. "Perhaps too careful?" Clara's expression did not change. "Careful in what way?" she asked. Miss Marple leaned back slightly. "In every way," she said. "The tea, for example." A small silence. Eleanor felt it tighten around the room. Miss Marple continued. "You ensured that Mr. Bellamy's tea was prepared exactly as he expected, that it would not arouse suspicion, that it would appear entirely ordinary." Clara said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "But you also ensured that it would not be finished." Eleanor's breath caught. Inspector Hughes looked sharply at Clara. "The tea," he said. "You believe it was altered?" Miss Marple nodded. "A slow-acting substance," she said. "One that would not cause immediate distress. One that would allow Mr. Bellamy to move, to think, to follow the instructions in the note." She paused. "But one that would weaken him, subtly, gradually." Clara's hands were still, too still. Miss Marple's gaze did not leave her. "So that when he reached the cellar," she continued, "he would be less steady than usual, more likely to misstep, more likely to fall." Inspector Hughes stepped closer. "And the stone," he said. "You altered it, to ensure the fall." Clara's smile remained, but something beneath it shifted. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "the stone was prepared in advance, adjusted just enough to create instability but not enough to draw attention, and when the note was hidden beneath it, it served a second purpose." Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "To bring him there." "Yes," Miss Marple said. Clara's eyes moved to the table, to the cups, to the arrangement. Perfect. Controlled. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman named Mrs. Halford who believed that if everything in her house was arranged perfectly, nothing could go wrong. She controlled every detail, every movement, every outcome." She paused. "But life, you see, does not respond well to such control." The room held its breath. Miss Marple looked at Clara. "My dear," she said gently, "you arranged everything. The letter, the note, the tea, the stone." A final pause. "But you could not control one thing." Clara looked up. "And what was that?" she asked. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but very clear. "The fact," she said softly, "that someone would notice. Silence. Complete. And in that silence, Clara Finch's smile began, very slowly, to fade. Chapter 11. What control cannot hold. Clara Finch did not protest. That, more than anything, altered the room. There was no sharp denial, no raised voice, no sudden collapse into distress. Instead, she stood where she was, her hands still resting lightly against the back of the chair, and allowed the silence to settle properly as though it too were something she had arranged and must now observe to its conclusion. Inspector Hughes did not rush forward. He had the sense, Eleanor thought, to understand that movement too early, too forcefully, would disturb something delicate that had not yet fully revealed itself. Miss Marple, for her part, did not move at all. "My dear," she said softly, "it is often a relief, in the end, not to maintain appearances quite so carefully." Clara gave a small, almost inaudible exhale. "You think this is about appearances," she said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically. But the warmth had thinned. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh no," she replied. "I think appearances were simply the method, not the reason." Clara's gaze moved across the table over the guests, the candles, the carefully arranged plates. "You've all been very observant," she said. "More than I expected." Mr. Harding shifted in his seat. "Now see here, this is all getting rather—" Inspector Hughes raised a hand slightly. Not abrupt, not harsh, but sufficient. Clara continued. "It was meant to be simple," she said. "A man with a predictable routine, a small alteration, an unfortunate fall. The sort of thing that happens in old buildings all the time." She looked at Miss Marple. "You said as much yourself. Accidents are plausible?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "They are. Which is why they are so often chosen." Clara's eyes lingered on her. "And yet," she said, "you did not accept it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a gentleman named Mr. Alderton who staged a most convincing burglary. Everything arranged perfectly. The broken window, the scattered drawers, the missing items. It was all quite admirable in its way. But he overlooked one small detail." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And what was that?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "He had taken only the things he valued," she said, "not the things a thief would have chosen." A faint flicker crossed Clara's expression. "You mean," she said, "I overlooked something?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "My dear," she replied softly, "you overlooked very little. That is precisely the difficulty." The room remained still. Clara's hands moved, then not abruptly but slowly, as though releasing something that had been held too long. She stepped away from the chair and walked to the window. Outside, the courtyard lay in shadow. "I did not intend for it to be complicated," she said. Inspector Hughes spoke quietly. "Then why was it?" Clara did not turn. "Because he made it so," she said. There it was, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Miss Marple watched her with that same quiet attentiveness. "Yes," she said, "that is often how these things begin." Clara's reflection in the window was faint, distorted by the glass. "He was a careful man," she continued. "So precise, so certain of himself, of his position, of what he could and could not do." She paused. "And what he could take." Eleanor felt a shift in movement beneath the surface of what had, until now, been arrangement and control. "You knew him before," she said. Clara turned slightly, not fully, but enough. "Yes," she said. "A long time ago." Inspector Hughes stepped closer. "The letter," he said. "It was from you." Clara's lips curved not quite into a smile. "Yes," she said. "Of course it was." "And the note," Hughes continued. "The meeting in the cellar." "Yes," Clara said again. "He would not have come otherwise." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And the tea," she said. Clara's eyes flickered just once. "Yes," she said. "That as well." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "You poisoned him," she said. Clara looked at her not unkindly. "I prepared him," she said. The distinction settled into the room. Miss Marple spoke softly. "A preparation for what, my dear?" Clara turned fully now, facing them all. "For truth," she said. There was a small silence. Inspector Hughes's voice was steady. "You will need to be clearer than that." Clara's expression did not change. He believed himself untouchable, she said. Years ago he arranged legal matters that ensured certain things would never come to light. Certain obligations would never be acknowledged. Her gaze moved briefly to the table. To everyone else he was respectable, reliable, a man of habit. She looked at Miss Marple. But habits can be used, she said. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, she said. They can. Clara took a step forward. I did not intend to kill him, she said. Inspector Hughes's expression sharpened. You arranged a meeting in a cellar with a weakened man and an altered step. Clara met his gaze. I intended for him to understand, she said. Eleanor frowned. Understand what? Clara's voice was quiet. That he was not in control, she said. The word settled. Miss Marple watched her. And when he fell? She asked. Clara's eyes lowered just slightly. That was not part of the plan, she said. Inspector Hughes's tone remained even. But you prepared for the conditions. Yes, Clara said. I prepared them. There was no denial in her voice, no attempt to soften it. Miss Marple spoke again. My dear, she said gently, one always finds that when people speak of intention, they choose the part that comforts them. But intention is not a single moment. It is a series of choices. Clara's gaze lifted. I know that, she said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. I believe you do. A long silence followed. Then Inspector Hughes closed his notebook. Miss Finch, he said. I must ask you to come with me. Clara inclined her head. Of course, she said. She moved toward the door, calm, composed as she had been all day. At the threshold she paused. Miss Marple, she said. Miss Marple looked at her. Yes, my dear. Clara's expression was difficult to read now, not cold, not warm, but something in between. You noticed very quickly, she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One does not notice quickly, she replied. One simply does not stop noticing. Clara held her gaze for a moment longer, then she left the room. Inspector Hughes followed. The door closed behind them, and the careful arrangement, the control, the precision was gone. Left behind in its place was something far less ordered and far more human. Chapter 12. What was always there. The inn did not sleep that night. It pretended to. Doors were closed, lamps lowered, footsteps softened, but beneath it all there remained a quiet awareness, as though every wall and corridor held its breath in expectation of something that had not yet entirely settled. Eleanor lay awake for some time before finally rising. The room felt close, not physically, but in that inward way that comes when the mind refuses stillness. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor where the faint glow of a single lamp stretched shadows longer than they ought to be. She found Miss Marple in the morning room. Of course she did. Miss Marple sat exactly where she had on the first day, her hands folded, her gaze resting not on anything in particular, but on the quiet arrangement of the room itself. My dear, she said softly as Eleanor entered, one often finds that sleep is quite impossible when the mind has not yet completed its work. Eleanor smiled faintly. I thought you might be here. Miss Marple inclined her head. Habit, you see. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out into the courtyard. It was dark now, the cobblestones barely visible, their uneven surfaces reduced to suggestion. It's over, isn't it? She said. She admitted everything. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Admitted, she said at last, is not quite the same thing as understood. Eleanor turned. What do you mean? Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, though there was no need. My dear, she said gently, Clara Finch has explained her actions, but explanation is not the same as truth. It is merely the version of truth one finds easiest to live with. Eleanor felt a small unease return. You think she wasn't telling the whole story? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think she told exactly the part of the story she wished to tell, she said. Eleanor moved closer, her brow furrowed. But she admitted to everything, the letter, the note, the tea, the stone. Yes, Miss Marple said. She admitted to the arrangement. Eleanor hesitated. And that's not enough? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. My dear, it is almost enough, which is what makes it so very interesting. Eleanor felt the tension return quiet, persistent. What's missing? She asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose slowly and moved toward the table by the window. The difficulty, she said, is that Clara Finch is a woman who does nothing without purpose. Every action she takes is considered, measured, controlled. She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. And yet, she continued, we are asked to believe that one crucial part of her plan was left to chance. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The fall, she said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. The fall. Eleanor's thoughts moved quickly. But she said she didn't intend for him to die, that she only meant for him to understand, Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, Eleanor said. Exactly. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the window. One always finds, she said softly, that when people speak of intention, they describe the moment just before things become irreversible. It allows them to place a boundary between what they meant to do and what actually occurred. She turned back to Eleanor, but in reality those moments are rarely so separate. Eleanor felt a chill. You think she did intend it, she said. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said. I think she understood it. Eleanor frowned. I don't see the difference. Miss Marple smiled gently. It is the difference between pushing someone and removing the last support beneath them, she said. In both cases the result may be the same, but one allows the person to believe they are not responsible. Eleanor stood very still. So the stone, she began. Yes, Miss Marple said. The stone was not merely altered, it was placed. Eleanor's breath caught. Placed? Miss Marple nodded. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was a man, Mr. Jennings, who claimed that a ladder had slipped beneath him while he was painting his house. He insisted it was an accident, and in a sense it was. The ladder did slip, she paused. But what he did not say, she added softly, was that he had positioned it on uneven ground, not carelessly, quite deliberately, because he wished to avoid being seen from the road. Eleanor felt the meaning settle. He created the conditions, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and then allowed the outcome to occur. Eleanor turned back to the window, her gaze moving over the darkened courtyard. Clara did the same thing, she said. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the chair and sat down again. My dear, she said, Clara Finch is not a woman who leaves outcomes to chance. She arranged everything, the letter, the note, the tea, the timing. She knew exactly how Mr. Bellamy would respond, exactly where he would go, she paused. And she knew, she added, what would happen when he reached the cellar. Eleanor felt a slow, dawning understanding. She didn't push him, she said. No, Miss Marple replied. She made it inevitable. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. The room was very quiet. Eleanor turned back to her. Then why didn't she say so? She asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because it is much easier, she said, to live with the idea of an accident than with the knowledge of certainty. Eleanor sat down slowly. And you? She asked. Do you think she feels regret? Miss Marple's gaze softened. I think, she said, that she feels exactly what she has allowed herself to feel. Eleanor looked down at her hands. And what does that mean? Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. It means that she has even arranged her remorse, she said. A long silence followed. Then Eleanor spoke again. And the letter? She asked. The one she sent him. What was it really about? Miss Marple leaned back slightly. That, she said, is the part she did not explain. Eleanor looked up. Then how do we know? Miss Marple's eyes moved to the door, then back to Eleanor. One does not always know, she said. But one may understand. She folded her hands once more. Mr. Bellamy was a man who controlled outcomes, she continued. Through legal means, through arrangements, through silence. It is quite possible that Clara Finch once found herself on the wrong side of such control. Eleanor felt a quiet sadness settle. So this was revenge? Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said, not revenge. Eleanor frowned. Then what? Miss Marple looked at her. Correction, she said softly. The word lingered. Eleanor looked back at the window. The courtyard lay still, unchanged, and yet everything about it had shifted. Miss Marple rose once more, moving toward the door. Come, my dear, she said. There is very little more to be done tonight. Eleanor followed her. At the threshold she paused, looking back at the room, the table, the chairs, the place where the teacup had once sat. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "did we miss anything?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear," she replied, "one always misses something." She stepped into the corridor. "But one hopes," she added gently, "that it is not the thing that matters most." And with that she moved away, leaving behind a room that held its quiet, and a truth that had perhaps been present from the very beginning, waiting only to be understood. Chapter 13. The Cup That Was Finished. The morning did not announce itself. It arrived in small adjustments, the faint pale lifting at the edge of the curtains, the quiet settling of boards that had held the night's weight, the first distant movement of someone in the kitchen below. The inn did not wake all at once. It resumed. Eleanor sat once more in the morning room. She had come early, earlier than she had on any previous day. It felt important, not for any clear reason, but because beginnings, she had begun to understand, often required a kind of quiet that came only before the day properly arranged itself. The room looked as it always had. The small tables, thin china, the careful attempt at gentility. And yet it was not the same. Miss Marple entered shortly after, her step unhurried, her expression as composed as ever. "My dear," she said, taking her seat, "you're quite right to come early. One sees things more clearly before they have had time to adjust." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure what I expected to see." Miss Marple folded her gloves. "One never is," she said. "That is rather the point." A young maid entered Sarah, Eleanor recalled. She carried a tray with 2 cups, her movements less practiced than Clara's had been, but earnest. "Miss Finch asked me to go to breakfast this morning," she said, placing the tray on the table. "She's not here, of course." Her voice faltered slightly. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "You are doing very well, my dear," she said. "It is not an easy thing to continue when something has changed." Sarah nodded, then left. Eleanor looked at the cups. They were not perfectly aligned, not quite symmetrical. One sat slightly nearer the edge than the other. She felt something in her chest ease just a little. Miss Marple reached for her cup, and this time she drank. Eleanor watched her. "You didn't drink the tea before," she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "I did not." "Because you suspected." "Because I observed," Miss Marple corrected gently. Eleanor nodded. "And now?" Miss Marple set the cup down. "Now," she said. "There is no longer anything to observe in that particular respect." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor spoke. "It feels strange," she said. "That it's over." Miss Marple considered this. "My dear," she said, "things such as this are never entirely over. They simply reach a point where they no longer require our attention." Eleanor looked at her. "And Clara?" Miss Marple's gaze moved to the window. "She will have to live with what she has done," she said, "and with what she has chosen to believe about it." Eleanor hesitated. "Do you think she'll ever understand it fully?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "One rarely understands oneself fully," she said, "particularly when one has taken great care not to." Eleanor nodded slowly. Outside, the courtyard lay as it had before, uneven, quiet, holding its shape without effort. "The stone," she said. "They'll fix it, won't they?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied. "It will be set properly, levelled, made safe." She paused. "But the mark of its alteration will remain in some form. These things always do." Eleanor looked down at her cup. "I keep thinking about the letter," she said. "What it really meant. What she wanted him to understand." Miss Marple folded her hands. "In street." "Mary Mead," she said. "There was a woman named Mrs. Keeling discovered, quite late in life, that her husband had arranged their affairs in such a way that she would never have access to anything of her own. Everything is controlled. Everything was decided in advance." She paused. "She did not confront him," she continued. "She did not argue. She simply altered a few small details over time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing one could object to." Eleanor listened carefully. "And what happened?" she asked. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "In the end," she said, "he found himself entirely dependent on the very system he had created, and for the first time he understood what it meant to have no control at all." Eleanor felt the meaning settle. Clara wanted that, she said, for Bellamy to understand. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Though understanding, as we have seen, is not always a gentle thing. Eleanor looked out at the courtyard again. And she succeeded, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. She did. There was a long silence. Then Eleanor spoke again. Miss Marple, she said, what was the thing that mattered most? The thing we might have missed? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, she said, it was there from the beginning. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. The teacup? She asked. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not the teacup itself, she said, but what it represented. Eleanor frowned. I'm not sure I understand. Miss Marple looked at her. It was not simply that the tea was unfinished, she said. It was that it had been prepared so carefully, so precisely, that it could not have been accidental. She paused. That level of care, she added softly, is never applied without purpose. Eleanor felt a quiet clarity. It was the intention, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Always the intention. She lifted her cup again, taking another small sip. Eleanor followed her example. The tea was ordinary, warm, unremarkable, and yet it felt different. Miss Marple set her cup down. One always finds, she said, that people reveal themselves most clearly not in what they do, but in how they choose to do it. Eleanor nodded. And Clara chose to be careful, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Very careful. A faint smile touched her lips. And that, my dear, she added, is what allowed us to understand her. They sat together in silence for a moment longer. Then Miss Marple rose. I think, she said, that it is time to leave. Eleanor stood as well. Yes, she said, I think so too. They moved toward the door. At the threshold, Eleanor paused, looking back at the room, at the table, at the cups, at the place where everything had begun. Miss Marple followed her gaze. One must not linger too long, she said gently. Places such as this have a way of holding one. Eleanor nodded. Then she turned and stepped into the corridor. Behind them, the morning room settled into its quiet arrangement. The cups remained. The light shifted, and on the table, for the first time since the beginning, every cup had been finished.